Let's get something straight. This isn't about revenge. Revenge keeps you tethered to the very thing that hurt you. And a narcissist doesn't fall apart because you fight harder. They fall apart because you stop playing the game altogether. A narcissist survives on attention, reaction, emotional chaos. They need you doubting yourself so they can feel powerful. But here's what they never expect. An empath who wakes up, a super empath, doesn't become heartless. They become clear. Clear about what they will no longer tolerate. Clear about the difference between love and self-betrayal. Clear about the fact that empathy does not mean endless access. And that clarity, that's terrifying to someone who relies on manipulation. You see, the narcissist believes your kindness is weakness. They mistake your patience for permission. But what they don't realize is that empathy, when paired with self-respect, becomes unshakable strength. The moment you stop explaining yourself, they panic. The moment you stop reacting, they unravel. The moment you stop seeking validation from someone incapable of giving it, the entire illusion collapses. Because narcissists don't fear confrontation. They fear independence. They fear the day you no longer need them to define your worth. And here's the divine principle in all of this. When you choose yourself, you are not abandoning love. You are honoring it. Love was never meant to cost you your peace, your dignity, or your identity. A super empath destroys a narcissist not by breaking them, but by becoming whole, by healing so deeply that the narcissist no longer recognizes the version of you they once controlled by standing so firmly in self-worth that manipulation has nowhere to land, by loving yourself so fully that chaos feels out of place in your life. And when that happens, something remarkable occurs. The narcissist fades, not because you push them away in anger, but because there is no longer anything in you that responds to their tactics. That is the real power. That is the quiet victory. That is what happens when empathy meets boundaries. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need closure from someone who thrived on confusion. Your growth is the ending they never wanted and the freedom you always deserved. When you rise, the game ends. A narcissist is not undone by arguments, exposure, or dramatic exits. In fact, those things often do the opposite of what you intend. They energize them. Conflict keeps them relevant. Emotional reactions reassure them that they still matter, that they still have influence, that they still occupy space in your mind and nervous system. The narcissist doesn't fear being hated. They fear being nothing. And this is where most people get it wrong. They try to win by engaging harder, explaining more, proving their pain. But every explanation is still a conversation, and every conversation is still fuel. Irrelevance, on the other hand, is starvation. When a narcissist realizes they can no longer provoke a reaction, they experience something deeply unsettling, a loss of identity, because their sense of self is built externally. It's built on admiration, fear, emotional dependency, or chaos. Take those away, and they don't know who they are in the room anymore. That's why silence confuses them more than shouting ever could. That's why calm detachment feels like rejection at a cellular level. Irrelevant doesn't mean pretending they don't exist while secretly watching their every move. That's avoidance, not freedom. True irrelevance happens internally first. It's the moment their opinion stops carrying weight. The moment their approval is no longer currency. The moment their moods stop dictating the emotional weather of your day. From the outside, it looks simple. On the inside, it requires enormous discipline and self-respect. A narcissist is skilled at pulling people back into orbit. They use nostalgia, guilt, charm, or sudden vulnerability. Not because they've changed, but because they felt the absence of supply. And supply isn't love, it's attention. Good or bad doesn't matter. Intense emotion of any kind reassures them of their importance. When you start offering that, you disrupt the system that sustained them. What makes irrelevance so powerful is that it cannot be argued with. You can debate accusations. You can twist facts. You can gaslight someone who's trying to explain themselves. But you cannot manipulate someone who has emotionally checked out. There is no leverage, no hooks, no pressure point. And that absence of control is deeply destabilizing to someone who built their sense of safety on control. For the empath, this is not an act of cruelty. It's an act of alignment. It's choosing peace over performance. It's recognizing that you don't need to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. Irrelevance is not punishment. It's a boundary that doesn't require constant enforcement. It's the natural result of withdrawing emotional investment from a dynamic that was draining you. And here's the quiet truth. When you become irrelevant to a narcissist, they often try to make themselves relevant to you again. Louder messages, bigger gestures, stronger attempts to provoke jealousy or fear. This isn't proof that you mattered in a healthy way. It's proof that they've lost access. And loss of access feels like annihilation to someone who never learned how to self-regulate. Irrelevance restores your power because it returns your attention to where it always belonged: your own life, your own healing, your own future. The narcissist may still exist. They may still talk. They may still perform, but they are no longer central. And when someone who lived at the center of your emotional world is moved to the periphery, the dynamic collapses on its own. That is why irrelevance is so effective. It doesn't attack. It doesn't chase. It doesn't prove. It simply removes the oxygen. And without oxygen, even the most carefully constructed illusion cannot survive. Emotional clarity is what happens when you finally understand what belongs to you and what does not. A narcissist thrives on reaction because reaction blurs that line. When you're reacting, you're no longer choosing, you're responding on autopilot. Your nervous system is hijacked, your emotions are stirred, and suddenly their behavior dictates your inner state. That's the trap. And the way out is not emotional suppression, but emotional precision. A narcissist studies reactions like a language. They learn which words trigger guilt, which silences provoke anxiety, which behaviors pull you into over-explaining. Reaction gives them data. It teaches them how to reach inside you and press the right buttons. Emotional clarity removes the buttons altogether. It's the difference between feeling something and being controlled by it. Clarity begins the moment you stop asking, "How do I make them understand?" and start asking, "Why am I still explaining myself to someone who benefits from misunderstanding me?" That question alone shifts the power dynamic. Because now you're observing instead of absorbing. You're witnessing patterns instead of personalizing them. You're no longer inside the storm, you're watching it pass. Reaction feels urgent. It feels justified. It feels like self-defense. But most reactions are rooted in the hope that if you respond correctly, the dynamic will finally change. Clarity acts. PTS, a harder truth. Some people are not confused. They are committed to control, to superiority, to never being wrong. Once you see that, your energy changes. You stop performing emotional labor for someone who never intended to meet you halfway. Emotional clarity doesn't mean you feel nothing. It means you feel accurately. You can feel anger without lashing out, disappointment without collapsing, grief without begging for repair from the source of the wound. This is what makes clarity so unsettling to a narcissist. It denies them emotional chaos, and chaos is where they feel powerful. When you react, you're pulled into their tempo. Fast replies, heightened emotions, circular conversations. When you're clear, you move at your own pace. You pause. You respond only when necessary. You don't rush to defend your character to someone invested in misrepresenting it. That calm is not accidental. It's the byproduct of knowing yourself well enough that external distortion doesn't shake your identity. A narcissist expects emotional intensity. Tears, rage, long messages, dramatic exits. What they don't expect is neutrality paired with self-assurance. They don't know how to navigate someone who can say, "This doesn't work for me," without needing to justify, convince, or escalate. Clarity closes doors without slamming them, and that's deeply disorienting to someone who relies on emotional extremes. For the empath, this shift can feel unnatural at first. You're used to attuning, accommodating, adjusting. Emotional clarity asks you to redirect that empathy inward, to notice your own discomfort instead of overriding it, to trust your internal signals instead of questioning them every time someone challenges your perception. That's not selfishness, that's maturity. Reaction keeps you entangled. Clarity sets you free, not because it changes the narcissist, but because it changes your relationship to their behavior. You stop seeing every interaction as something to fix. You stop interpreting their moods as emergencies. You stop handing them authority over your emotional state. And once that happens, something powerful emerges: consistency. Your responses become steady, predictable, uninteresting to someone who feeds on volatility. You are no longer a mirror reflecting their chaos back to them. You are grounded, centered, and emotionally sovereign. That sovereignty is the quiet strength of the super empath. Not loud, not dramatic. Just unmistakably unmovable dot and troll is the currency of a narcissist. It's how they regulate their emotions, stabilize their identity, and reassure themselves that they matter. When they feel in control, they feel safe. When they don't, they feel exposed. That's why control rarely looks obvious at first. It disguises itself as concern, guidance, intensity, or knowing what's best for you. And because empaths are wired to trust connection, they often don't realize control has entered the room until their self-worth has quietly slipped out. A narcissist doesn't need to dominate you openly. They only need you to doubt yourself. Every time you question your memory, your feelings, your standards, or your needs, control tightens. It's subtle. It sounds like you're too sensitive, or no one else would put up with this, or you're lucky I care this much. These aren't just words. They are attempts to position themselves above you as the authority on your reality. Empaths lose power not because they are weak, but because they are generous with trust. They assume others are operating with the same integrity and emotional honesty they are. A narcissist exploits that generosity by slowly shifting the empath's focus outward toward approval, validation, reassurance until self-worth becomes conditional. Conditional on behavior, conditional on compliance, conditional on keeping the peace. Reclaiming self-worth is not about becoming arrogant or dismissive. It's about restoring your internal authority. It's remembering that your value is not negotiated through someone else's moods, standards, or approval. The moment you stop measuring yourself through their reactions, control begins to dissolve. A narcissist feels powerful when they believe they are needed for validation, needed for direction, needed for emotional permission. But self-worth removes that dependency. When you know who you are, you don't ask someone else to define it for you. And that is deeply destabilizing to someone whose power came from SH. Aping your self-perception. This is why reclaiming self-worth often triggers resistance. When you stop seeking approval, a narcissist may accuse you of changing. When you stop over-explaining, they may call you cold. When you stop prioritizing their comfort over your truth, they may frame you as selfish. These accusations are not reflections of who you've become. They are signal that control is slipping. Self-worth changes how you move. You stop negotiating boundaries. You stop justifying basic needs. You stop shrinking to maintain connection. You don't need to threaten, demand, or dominate. You simply choose differently. And choice is something a narcissist struggles to tolerate when it doesn't center them. For the empath, reclaiming self-worth can feel uncomfortable at first because it disrupts old survival patterns. You may feel guilt for saying no, anxiety for not fixing, fear for disappointing someone who once felt essential. But those feelings are not evidence that you're doing something wrong. They're evidence that you're undoing conditioning. Control thrives where self-worth is outsourced. When your sense of value lives inside you, manipulation has nowhere to attach. A narcissist can attempt to provoke insecurity, but it won't land the same way. Their tactics rely on emotional hooks, and self-worth dulls the hooks. What's powerful here is that you don't have to confront control directly. You don't have to expose it, argue against it, or dismantle it piece by piece. You simply stop participating. You stop handing over your self-esteem exchange for conditional affection. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. And when that happens, the dynamic shifts. The narcissist may escalate control attempts, or they may disengage in search of easier supply. Either way, the center of gravity returns to you. You are no longer reacting to their need for dominance. You are rooted in your own sense of value. That is how empaths win. Not by overpowering, but by remembering who they were before they forgot their worth. Detachment is often misunderstood because people confuse it with indifference. Indifference says, I don't care. Detachment says, I care enough about myself to stop abandoning my needs. That distinction matters, especially for empaths, because detachment isn't about shutting down your heart. It's about closing the door to disrespect. It's self-respect made visible through action. A narcissist interprets emotional availability as access. If you are always willing to listen, explain, forgive, or stay engaged, They read that as permission. Permission to cross lines. Permission to repeat patterns. Permission to avoid accountability. Detachment interrupts that unspoken contract. It quietly communicates. Access is no longer unconditional. This is why detachment feels threatening to a narcissist. They are comfortable with anger, tears, even ultimatums, because those still signal emotional investment. What unsettles them is calm withdrawal. Fewer explanations, shorter responses, a noticeable lack of urgency, not because you're punishing them, but because you've stopped prioritizing their emotional needs over your own stability. Self-respect doesn't announce itself. It doesn't argue its case. It doesn't beg to be understood. It simply adjusts behavior in alignment with truth. When an empath detaches, it's usually after a long period of trying harder, loving deeper, and giving more chances than were ever deserved. Detachment is not the first response, it's the final correction. What makes detachment powerful is that it's internal before it's external. It begins when you stop needing them to validate your pain, when you no longer wait for an apology to move on, when you accept that understanding why someone hurt you does not obligate you to keep tolerating it. That internal shift changes the energy of every interaction. A narcissist often accuses detachment of being cold or cruel, but detachment is neither. It's neutral, it's grounded. It's the decision to stop engaging in emotional conversations that lead nowhere. It's recognizing that proximity without respect is not connection, it's erosion. For the empath, detachment can feel uncomfortable because it goes against old conditioning. You were taught that love means staying, fixing, accommodating. Detachment challenges that belief by introducing a new truth. Love without self-respect becomes self-betrayal. And self-betrayal is not noble, it's costly. Detachment. NT doesn't mean cutting people off dramatically or disappearing without explanation. It means no longer overfunctioning in relationships that underfunction in accountability. It means you respond when it aligns with your values, not when guilt or fear demands it. It means you stop rescuing others from the consequences of their behavior. This is where self-respect becomes visible. You don't argue about boundaries, you live them. You don't threaten to leave, you become less available. You don't demand change, you change your participation. And that consistency sends a message stronger than any speech ever could. A narcissist struggles with detachment because it removes leverage. There's nothing to push against, no emotional chaos to exploit, no reassurance to extract. Detachment creates space, and space reveals truth. In that space, patterns become obvious, excuses lose their power, and the dynamic can no longer hide behind intensity. For the empath, detachment restores dignity. You no longer feel drained after every interaction. You stop replaying conversations in your head. You regain access to your intuition, your peace, your sense of self. Detachment doesn't make you less loving, it makes your love more intentional. And perhaps most importantly, detachment teaches this lesson at a nervous system level. You are allowed to step back without becoming a villain. You are allowed to choose peace without proving your pain. You are allowed to honor yourself without explaining why. That is self-respect in motion. Anger feels powerful in the beginning because it creates momentum. It sharpens your focus, gives language to injustice, and temporarily restores a sense of control. But anger is still a tether. It keeps your nervous system oriented around the person who hurt you. A narcissist can work with anger. They can provoke it, twist it, dismiss it, or even enjoy it. What they cannot work with is healing, because healing removes their relevance entirely. When you are angry, part of your energy is still invested in being seen, validated, or vindicated. You want them to understand what they did. You want the truth acknowledged. You want justice. Those desires are human, but they keep the narcissist at the center of the story. Healing quietly moves them to the margins. Healing is not passive. It is active, disciplined, and deeply disruptive to toxic dynamics. It's the process of reclaiming your emotional autonomy, of learning to self-soothe instead of seeking repair from the person who caused the wound, of no longer rehearsing conversations that will never bring closure. Each step of healing withdraws emotional supply without a single confrontation. A narcissist's power comes from occupying space in your inner world, your thoughts, your triggers, your self-doubt. Healing evicts them from that space, not through force, but through replacement. You begin filling your inner life with self-trust, supportive relationships, meaningful goals, and calm routines. And as that inner world strengthens, their influence weakens. This is why healing often feels threatening to a narcissist, even if they can't articulate why. You become less reactive, less explainable, less predictable. Their words don't land the same way. Their provocations don't create the same spike. You are no longer emotionally malleable. And malleability is what they relied on. Anger wants to confront the past. Healing builds a future. Anger says, look at what you did to me. Healing says, look at who I am becoming. That shift is profound. It reorients your identity away from victimhood without denying the harm that occurred. You don't minimize the pain, you integrate it. Healing also restores discernment. You begin to see patterns clearly, without the emotional fog. You stop romanticizing intensity. You recognize manipulation without needing to label or expose it. You trust your discomfort instead of overriding it. This quiet clarity makes it impossible for old tactics to work. What's important to understand is that healing does not require forgiveness on a timeline that feels dishonest. It does not require reconciliation. It does not require compassion that costs you safety. Healing is about releasing the grip someone has on your emotional life, not excusing what they did. A narcissist loses power when you no longer need them to be different in order for you to be okay. That's the moment the dynamic collapses, because now your peace is self-generated, you're stable. It is internal. Your worth is no longer reactive. And without your emotional dependency, there is nothing left for them to control. This is why healing often looks boring from the outside. Fewer dramatic stories, fewer emotional spikes, more consistency, more calm. But that boring is actually regulation. It's your nervous system. Learning that chaos is not love and peace is not emptiness. Anger burns hot and fast. Healing burns slow and steady. One exhausts you, the other rebuilds you. And in that rebuilding, something irreversible happens. You stop organizing your life around the person who hurt you. That's when the narcissist's power truly disappears. Not because they were defeated, but because they were outgrown. Boundaries are simple, but they are not easy, especially for someone who was conditioned to prioritize harmony over honesty. A boundary is not an argument, a threat, or a negotiation. It is a line that defines where you end and someone else begins. And for a narcissist, that line is deeply unsettling because their entire way of relating depends on crossing it. Manipulators rely on ambiguity. They thrive where expectations are unclear, where rules shift, where emotions override structure. Boundaries introduce clarity into a system built on confusion. They remove loopholes, they eliminate emotional bargaining. And that's why a narcissist doesn't just dislike boundaries, they are confused by them. When you set a boundary, you are no longer asking for permission to exist as you are. You are stating conditions for access. This immediately disrupts the narcissist's sense of entitlement. They are used to pushing, pressing, reframing, and guilt-tripping until they get compliance. But a boundary that is calmly stated and consistently upheld leaves tea. And with no script to follow, what confuses them most is that a real boundary doesn't come with emotional theatrics. It's not loud. It's not angry. It doesn't try to convince. It simply exists. I'm not available for that. That doesn't work for me. I won't continue this conversation if it turns disrespectful. These statements don't attack, but they don't yield either. And that neutrality short-circuits manipulation. A narcissist expects one of two responses: submission or escalation. Boundaries offer neither. They offer presence without access, connection without control. And that feels illogical to someone who equates closeness with dominance. When you no longer bend, over-explain, or rescue, they don't know where to place you in their hierarchy. For the empath, boundaries can initially feel harsh because you're used to earning love through flexibility. You may worry you're being mean, selfish, or difficult. But boundaries are not walls, they are filters. They don't keep everyone out, they keep dysfunction from getting in. And anyone who benefits from your lack of boundaries will protest loudly when you finally install them. This protest often shows up as confusion. Why are you acting like this? You've never had a problem before. You're being dramatic. These reactions are not genuine questions, they are attempts to pull you back into the old dynamic where your needs were negotiable and theirs were absolute. Boundaries disrupt that imbalance. What makes boundary especially powerful with narcissists is consistency. A boundary stated once but not upheld becomes a suggestion. A boundary upheld without emotion becomes law. You don't need to punish. You don't need to explain again. You simply follow through by changing your behavior. You leave the room. You end the call. You disengage. And each time you do, the boundary becomes clearer. Narcissists struggle with this because they are accustomed to bending reality through persistence. If they push long enough, most people fold. Boundaries remove that payoff. Pushing no longer works. Charm no longer works. Guilt no longer works. And without those tools, they are forced to confront a limit they cannot cross. For the empath, boundaries restore orientation. You no longer feel disoriented after interactions. You stop questioning whether you're allowed to feel what you feel. You stop contorting yourself to avoid conflict. Boundaries give your nervous system a sense of safety because it knows there is a plan for what happens when respect disappears. And here's the quiet truth. Boundaries don't require the other person's understanding to be valid. They don't require agreement. They don't even require acknowledgement. Their power comes from enforcement, not explanation. The moment you stop waiting for permission to protect your peace, you step into authority over your own life. That authority is what confuses manipulators the most because they cannot cross a line that does not move, and they cannot control someone who knows where they stand. A narcissist does not relate to people as separate, whole individuals. They relate to reflection. They look for mirrors that confirm their superiority, their victimhood, their importance. In relationships, they don't ask, "Who are you?" They ask, often unconsciously, "What do you reflect back to me?" Validation, admiration, emotional responsiveness, these become the surface through which they recognize themselves. Without that mirror, their sense of identity destabilizes. An empath, especially a super empath, is an exceptionally powerful mirror. They reflect emotion deeply. They respond with presence. They validate experiences even when they shouldn't have to. This level of attunement makes the narcissist feel seen, important, and central. Over time, the narcissist begins to rely on the empath, not just for attention, but for identity regulation. The empath becomes the emotional reference point. But something changes the moment the empath chooses themselves. Choosing yourself doesn't look dramatic. It looks like no longer over-accommodating, no longer adjusting your truth to keep someone comfortable, no longer reflecting back a version of them that excuses harm or inflates ego. When that happens, the mirror doesn't shatter, it disappears. And for a narcissist, that absence is profoundly disorienting. They are suddenly left with themselves, without the empath buffering their insecurities or absorbing their projections. There's no one translating their behavior into something more palatable. No one softening consequences. No one offering emotional context that protects their self-image. The empath stepping into self-alignment removes the illusion the narcissist depended on. This is why narcissists often escalate. When an empath begins choosing themselves, they may accuse you of being selfish, cold, ungrateful, or changed. What they're really reacting to is the loss of reflection. They can no longer see the version of themselves they preferred through your eyes. And without that reflection, their internal emptiness becomes harder to ignore. For the empath, choosing yourself is not an act against anyone else. It's an act of coherence. Your values align with your behavior. Your intuition regains authority. You stop diluting your needs to preserve connection. This internal alignment changes your energy. You are no longer reactive, apologetic, or eager to repair what you didn't break. And that shift removes you from the narcissist's psychological ecosystem. A narcissist requires engagement to maintain narrative control. They need someone to argue with, persuade, impress, or destabilize. When you choose yourself, you stop playing assigned roles. You are no longer the caretaker, the challenger, the admirer, or the emotional regulator. You simply become unavailable for projection. What's crucial to understand is that the narcissist doesn't lose you. They lose access to who you used to be. The version of you that explained endlessly. The version that empathized past self-respect. The version that reflected their pain more clearly than they ever could. When that version disappears, the narcissist often feels abandoned, even though what's really happening. G is withdrawal of emotional labor. For the empath, choosing yourself can feel unfamiliar at first. You may feel guilt for not responding the way you used to. You may feel discomfort not fixing what feels broken. But that discomfort is not a sign of moral failure. It's the nervous system recalibrating after years of overextension. As you choose yourself consistently, something subtle but irreversible happens. Your presence no longer feeds dysfunction. Your empathy becomes selective. Your energy becomes self-directed. You still care, but you care with boundaries, discernment, and self-loyalty without your reflection. The narcissist is forced to confront a void they spent their life avoiding. Some will seek a new mirror elsewhere. Others will double down on control attempts. But either way, the dynamic cannot survive without your participation. When an empath chooses themselves, they don't destroy another person. They dissolve an illusion, and illusions cannot exist without someone to believe in them. Thank you for allowing this space to speak to your healing, strength, and truth. Goodbye for now. May you walk forward grounded, self-honoring, and unshakably at peace.